So welcome back to Anna, and there may be someone else who wasn't here last week, who maybe also isn't here this time. All right. So Anna, I know that you had a chance to watch the recordings. Do you have questions or things that you wanted to follow up on from those?
I'm good. The first one you went into the Council of Nicaea, and it was on a more of a timeline. And then the second one, it seemed like you went into greater detail about the background about it
Right.
all. So I felt like I was getting sort of the same stuff, just in a different perspective.
Right.
Oh.
Once you have a framework, then you can go into a little more detail about what's really going on there.
Right after Peggy said, "Is it Arian?" I had just looked it up because you kept saying it, and I was like, "Wait a minute!" And no, in fact, it's a different word. So
it is a totally different concept. That's right, and it's sort of confusing that it sounds the same because
only because we use the one with the Y so often in social culture. But
right, that's right. Well, once upon a time, no one would ever have heard of the Y ones, and they would have assumed that you meant the I ones. So it all depends on your point of reference. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about this this period in between like 70 AD with the fall of the temple and 325, which is the Council of Nicaea and the sort of emergence of Christianity as a political force. It begins with Constantine's conversion. So there's a period of about 12 years in there while Constantine is really moving from just beginning to take over the empire to really being in a position to tell people in the empire what to do, or being the person to whom the religious communities appeal when they have an issue, right? So that's how he ends up getting involved in the Donatist controversy. Everybody remember that, where the particularly in North Africa, it was a very vexed question, but the controversy sort of spread as well to other places, where the actual the decade in the East, or 3 or 4 years in the West of actual empire government persecution of Christianity that just preceded the advent of Constantine. During that time, one of the things that the government did was to demand that Christians surrender their texts. So that would have been the copies of the Gospels that they had, copies of the letters of Paul that they had. And those were, of course, precious things in an era when there was no printing press and everything had to be copied by hand. And, there were people, I'm sure, who, under threat to themselves or under threat to their families and their communities, they figured it was easier to hand over the texts than it was to, watch their children be executed or whatever. And then there were some who just did it out of a hope for advancement, that they could become functionaries or sources of authority within the Roman Empire if they cooperated with the forces of the Roman Empire. But either way, they were regarded as traitors by the rank and file Christians. And especially, I think it's interesting, especially by the illiterate ones, because for the ones who couldn't read, there was almost something magical about a text that someone else could read. I mean, it was like a superpower or something. And so the Christianity was not very focused on the permanent visual arts. at that point. They didn't have the big cathedrals that they would eventually have. They were starting to have tombs. That was probably some of the earliest actual visual art that they had. But if you don't have a place to keep things that are valuable, then you don't create permanent objects. So it's a little bit like the nomadic cultures that we talked about with the ancient Hebrews. You know, if you were traveling from place to place, everything that you had that you wanted to keep had to be portable. So whereas the pagan temples had big statues, they had frescoes, you know, as Peggy has shown us. They had works of art that were dedicated to their particular gods. For the Christians, all they really had were these texts. That was the thing that was sacred for them. And they got that from Judaism as well, that for the Jewish tradition, the law is sacred and the word is sacred and the Torah, the writing, is sacred. And you kind of see that in the way that they use the concept of logos as well, that logos, which is word, which is also the structure of the universe, is kind of another word for God or the creative power of God. So all of that comes together to kind of make these written messages that they had, these written texts, more than just, you know, written records of how many bushels of grain did you sell or how many jars of oil did you have. They had a kind of sacred value in themselves. So to be handing those over to the authorities to be destroyed, that was, it wasn't just the loss of the content. It was like a betrayal of the sacredness of those ideas. And so that was a big deal. And people were very distrustful of those leaders who had done that, and in most cases threw them out of office. And either they became sort of just garden variety Christians, or in some cases set a pox on your house and went off and became pagans again, or whatever they did. They no longer had authority in the church. But the question was, what became of the acts that they had done when they were in a position of authority, right? So if a priest who betrayed the church under persecution baptized you originally, was your baptism still valid? If that was the person who ordained you as a priest, was your ordination still valid? And the question that actually kind of made its way to Constantine's desk was, if you were ordained a bishop by someone who ultimately was guilty of surrendering to the imperial oppressive forces, were you a valid bishop? And there was a whole group of people in Carthage particularly whose answer to that question was no. You know, you can't be a bishop, not because you did anything wrong, but because the guy who ordained you did something wrong. And I don't actually know enough particulars about the story, but my guess is that there were a lot of church politics going on, and some group didn't like this bishop anyway, you know, and so the way they sort of came up with to try to get rid of him was to say, well, we know that you were ordained by this other guy who was ultimately found to be disloyal, and so therefore we want you out. And so they were the ones that complained to Constantine, and he kind of got sucked into being the arbiter, because what did he want more than anything? Why is Constantine in the middle of this? Anybody remember?
He just wants peace and unity in his grand world.
Empire, right? Exactly. So his whole point about Christianity is this is supposed to be a unifying factor. And if you Christian people can't even agree among each other, that isn't going to work for me, right? So his whole point is let's straighten this out. So he appeals first of all to the Bishop of Rome, right, which is one of the pieces that starts to make the Bishop of Rome a special category. And then they're not satisfied with that answer because the bishop sides with his brother bishop. Well, big surprise, right? And so then he calls a council of who? Other bishops, right? Well, what do we think we're going to hear from them? Same thing. So the complainers are still complaining. And at that point, Constantine originally thought they had a point. That was why he agreed to go through all these steps. But then he just got frustrated and said, you are disrupting the peace of the empire, and so I'm done with you. We are not going to have this argument anymore. Well, I mean, they kept having it, but he refused to support them in trying to get rid of this guy, and ultimately they did not, in fact, get rid of this guy. So that was sort of his first taste of church politics, right at the very beginning. But then the big one came in the early 300s, the early 320s, when there started to be this big argument about the nature of Jesus and people choosing up sides. But the historians point out that in 325, which was the year that the council actually happened, there were perhaps as many as 5 million Christians in the larger Roman Empire, and probably about 4 million Jews. So that gives you a sense at this point, the Christian sect of Judaism has exceeded the actual practitioners of Judaism as it had been traditionally understood. So they can no longer really hide in the shadow of saying, "Oh, we're just a weird kind of Jew," right? That doesn't fly anymore because there's actually more of them than there are of the real Jews. But still, that's out of approximately 60 million inhabitants of the empire, broadly conceived. So they're still not more than about a sixth of the population. Also, by this time, even by the time of Constantine's conversion, if you think about it, the letters of Paul, these foundational texts for the Christian community, are 250 years old. What do we have that's 250 years old in our culture?
Constitution.
Absolutely, right. And think of all the controversy and all the different interpretations we have today about what the Constitution means, what it says and how much authority we should give it, and who are the people that wrote it in the first place. And I mean, all of those same kinds of questions, when you have founding documents that are more than 2 centuries old, they just cannot address all your contemporary situations, right? And the same thing is happening with the Gospels. The ones that are actually going to end up in the canon are all at least 200 years old at that point. So they are getting antiquated as well. So there's a new form of literature that arises, and this is what I really want to talk about at this point. And the same thing happens with it as happened with the letters of Paul and with the Gospels, which is that it gets copied and sent around to the churches. And this is one of the reasons why it feels like the memories of all the Christian churches are sort of about all oppression all the time. That all the Christians were constantly being fed to the lions and martyred and repressed. And this is not true. The vast majority of Christians in the vast majority of the empire lived out their lives as Christians, and nobody bothered them about it. And another huge majority at some point maybe were asked to say a prayer for the emperor or make a sacrifice on behalf of the emperor, and either just went along with it and said all right, or said no, I really don't want to, and we're told okay. So an awful lot of people really didn't suffer that much. But what did happen was, when there was a local oppression, when there was a governor or some regional person who decided, like Nero did in 64, oh, let's blame the Christians for this because they're making the gods feel insulted, or they don't respect the state, they don't respect the empire. When those kinds of things happened, they would be written about. Either if the person themselves, and often it was the bishop or the priest, it was the literate person in the community who was most at risk, who would be identified as a leader in the community, and therefore more attention would be paid to them by the authorities than just the rank and file Christians, right? Well, if they were literate, then one of the things they could do was write about what happened to them. So there was this whole school of literature that arose that were called apologia. And this is the root of our current word apology, but it's really not at all saying you're sorry, or this is more like sorry, not sorry, kind of thing that we would say today. It's really an explanation of, or a defense of, what it meant to them to be a Christian and what it meant to them to be a martyr. So they would write these apologias, or other people who were theoretically their secretaries or their traveling companions or their advocates in one form or another would write about them. And in some cases, again, like the letters of Paul, that was fairly pseudonymous, that someone would say, oh, this character was really interesting, I am going to write his story as if I had been with him, as if it were a lived account, when maybe it wasn't. But it was sort of writing down and collecting all the stories that were circulating about that person. So you could either have an actual apologia, which is written by the martyr themselves before their martyrdom, or you can have what's called a martyrology, which is the story about that person written from the viewpoint of someone who knew them or knew the circumstances. Does that make sense? And these things as well would, once they were written, they would be circulated. I mean, it might be that the person would write this for the community that they served before they got sent to Rome to answer to the Roman authorities. And very, very often, rather than being executed in their local province under whoever the governor there was or the authorities were, if they were really obdurate, if they were really stubborn, and they really were determined that they were going to be martyred, the local authorities, they didn't want to have that happen locally, for one thing, because it might cause disturbances and riots, and people would see it, and people who knew the person would feel bad. And so it was very disruptive to actually execute people who wanted to be martyrs in their locality. But also, as we saw even with Jesus, the Romans were very particular. They were very guarded about who had the authority to administer capital punishment and under what circumstances. So there was always kind of, for the local governors, it's like, let me kick this upstairs because I don't want it to come back and haunt me, right? I don't want to get a message from the higher ups in Rome. What did you do that stupid thing for? Let them handle it. Let them take responsibility for it. So what would often happen is that the leader and anybody who also wanted to be stubborn and go with him would be sent to Rome for judgment. And that's why we think of it always as happening in the Roman amphitheater, or before Caesar, or before the emperor, because a lot of times if someone was going to be put to death, that's where it would happen. But everything took so long. I mean, travel took so long, and making arrangements took so long. Just writing a letter to Rome and getting a message back took a lot months. To hear, okay, I'm going to send you this guy, and then you get a message back saying, no, don't send him, you deal with him, or saying, don't send him until April because the emperor's not going to be in residence till then, or whatever the thing was. There had to be arrangements made. So while they're waiting, often they're writing these documents, which are partly a legal defense and argument, and also partly for the encouragement of other faithful people, other Christians, who may also find themselves in the same kind of situation. Does everybody see what kind of document we're talking about here? And this is the source of a lot of our information about this era. This is how we know what was going on in the minds of Christians, because for a long period, most of the Roman authorities and most of the Roman historians are not paying any attention to them. They are not relevant. They're not a subject of interest for anybody who's writing about the events of this century and a half or 2 centuries. So the Christians would write about responding to the charges that had been brought against them. And we've seen what some of those charges were, right? They were accused of atheism and endangering the empire. They were accused of sexual immorality, and they were accused of cannibalism and infanticide. Oops, wait a minute. There we go. Yeah. So they would be, their writing would then try to answer some of these charges. And also they would, what the local authorities, the governors or so on, wanted them to do usually was to just renounce Christianity as an exclusive thing. It wasn't that they needed to stop being Christians. It's that they needed to stop being Christians as opposed to supporting the cult of the emperor. So all they really usually had to do was to deny that they were, it would work to deny that they were Christians, to say, no, I'm not a Christian at all. Or to deny their office, to say, no, I'm not a priest, I'm not a bishop, I'm not a leader in this movement. Or they could pray either to or for the emperor. It was easier if it was for the emperor. Yeah.
Can't hear you.
Uh-oh.
You're losing your sound.
It's got to be something about the wires.
You went.
Did that help at all?
No.
Didn't help.
Little, but not much.
No.
Let me try one.
Are we having audio issues?
Yes. She's gone completely dead now.
No, no. Can you hear
It's
us?
nice to see that picture behind her, though.
We can hear you, Angie, but we can't hear Kendall.
Right.
me now?
There we go.
Say something.
Yeah. Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Much better.
Okay. All right. Good. I think if I unplug the other headset, then this one takes over.
Bob looks really different.
All right. Let me see if I can get back to. Okay. There we go. Now I can see you again.
Okay.
All right. And I can hear you. So if you can hear me, then we're good. Okay. All right. Cool. That's great. All right. So there were basically three things you could do to absolve yourself of the accusation and make the whole thing go away. One of which was denying that you were a Christian or a leader in the Christian movement. The other one of which was praying, excuse me, to or for the emperor. Now, there's really nothing in Christianity that prevents you from praying for somebody, but praying to somebody other than God and or Jesus, that's a little trickier. And that's part of why the whole argument about whether or not Jesus is God becomes significant. Because if Jesus is God, then it makes sense to pray to Jesus. If Jesus is not God, then it's more problematic to be praying to Jesus. And however, the way that the Roman paganism worked, you prayed to lots of different sacred beings, okay? And so the impulse to pray to Jesus was felt very comfortable. It felt very familiar to people who had been pagans at one point. And so this is why there's some uncertainty about how that's going to work. And that uncertainty will endure down through the Reformation and after. And the question of who should you pray to? Now, the Catholic Church, the Christianity that's going to emerge in the West, is going to be fairly promiscuous in terms of who you can pray to, right? You can pray to God, you can pray to Jesus, you can pray to Mary, his mother, you can pray to all different kind of saints, you can pray to the Holy Spirit, you can pray to lots of different entities in Catholicism prior to the Reformation. And then one of the things that's going to be at issue again when the Reformation comes along is who do we pray to? Who is it legitimate to offer prayers to? So this is the first incarnation of that argument. And then the other thing you could do to prove that you did not deserve to be punished as a Christian was to participate in a ceremony of sacrifice. So if you were willing to throw a pinch of incense on the altar, if you were willing to partake of meat that was offered in sacrifice as a sacrificial meal, any action that made you an accomplice in the offering of sacrifice to the Roman gods on behalf of the Roman Empire, that was all they really wanted. And you didn't have to give up Jesus. You didn't have to do anything cultically that was unsatisfying other than that one gesture, that one affirmation about being a good Roman citizen. Yeah, Mike.
Where did that render unto Caesar phrase originate? Is this at that point in time? Was that an active debate?
It's a story in the gospel, right? So it's supposedly something that Jesus said way back. So it's been around for quite a while at this point. If you figure the latest gospel was probably written about 110 or something like that. And that story was in there, but it certainly reflects the emergent sense of tension between what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? What does it mean to be a Christian? Versus what does it mean to be a citizen of the Roman Empire? And so, the idea is that, well, Jesus solved this dilemma by showing that there was a certain part of reality, there was a certain part of secular life that had to do with government, that had to do with empire, and that was not what he was about. That was not what his message was not about, that, because his message was about God, and what belonged to God was completely different from what belonged to Caesar. Now, that was not the message of the Roman Empire. As far as they were concerned, everything belonged to God and everything belonged to Caesar, and there was some connection actually between God and Caesar. So Jesus was proposing a kind of radical division that said that my integrity as a religious person is not owed to the government. In that sense, Jesus was the first advocate of separation of church and state. And for the Romans, church and state were completely integrated. There was no separation. It was a fused thing. But that's a good observation, that even as early as the formation of the Gospels, that tension was there. Okay, so I wanted to talk about a little bit about what's in these apologias. What kind of material are they talking about? And the first piece, which it's more developed in some and less developed in others, but it's almost always there in some form, is arguing with the premise of the accusation. And the most common argument was that normally when you're accused of a crime, you are accused of doing something, and you're invited to prove that you didn't do it. But the Christians say, well, we're not being accused of having done something. We're being accused of being something. And being something is not a crime. So, no one has proved that we have done something to be punished for. There is no legitimacy in punishing us for doing nothing in particular. Now, of course, the authorities thought that what they had done was to fail to cooperate in maintaining the well-being of the empire by participating in keeping the gods happy, right? So there was some sense that there was a thing that they were accused of not doing, but they were correct in the sense of, by and large, when they were accused of being Christians, they were accused of being Christians. And even though people had sort of lurid tales about what things that Christians did, in general, those accusations were not what was brought against particular individuals. So they would spend some time saying that this whole procedure is not legitimate. This whole procedure doesn't even conform to Roman law as we understand it, right? And actually, the more that they were Roman citizens, the more emphasis that was put on that. Because if you're a Roman citizen, that's one of the reasons why you can always appeal to the emperor. If you're a Roman citizen and you're condemned by some sub-authority of the empire, you kind of always have the right to say, I want to appeal to the emperor. And that's what the Donatists were doing when they were told, no, we're not going to fire your bishop. They wanted to appeal to the emperor. So that was something that people could frequently do. And so some of the apologists do that. And they want to say, it's sort of like when people file an appeal because there was some sort of procedural error in their trial. They're trying to say that there's a procedural error here. This isn't even really a crime that I'm being accused of. But then they would go on to argue why they were unwilling to renounce being Christians. And this part was more for the benefit of other Christians. These whole documents were really more for the benefit of other Christians than they were actually written with the hope that anyone in authority was going to be moved by them, right? I mean, they were almost always addressed as an appeal to the governor or as an appeal to the emperor, as an appeal to some named official, say, you know, and they would often praise that official and say, you know, I know you are in favor of justice, and I know you know, are a reasonable person. And so I want to tell you all about my situation in the hope that you might intervene. Probably that rarely happened, that person who was nominally being addressed would ever actually receive this document, or certainly ever read it and actually be, you know, influenced by it. So mostly what they were doing is encouraging other Christians to be faithful themselves, to not be discouraged by this. It has a little bit in common, if you think about it, with the literature that the Jewish tradition created during their captivity in Babylon, right? Because the question was, if we are right, if God is really on our side, why is this happening? So that the Jews had to explain how it was that they came to be in captivity if Yahweh was really so great, right? And the early Christians are having to explain to each other, why are they having all these trials and suffering if Jesus is really on their side? You know, if things are really supposed to be better for you once you become a Christian. And some of the arguments that they're going to develop in defense of that proposition are going to be kind of fundamental doctrines for the church for 1,000 years to come. So that's why they're of interest to us. Yes, Mike.
Did any of these people that that I assume they were named individuals later join the pantheon of sainthood through?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I gave you a few of their names. Origen of Alexandria, who is going to be an important person at the Council of Nicaea. He's going to be one of the ones who's defeated, whose position is rejected, and who goes into exile. So part of his apologia is defending why he got sent into exile for maintaining what he believes to be the true Christian doctrine. Their names are in the notes. A few of them you can look up. Justin Martyr is one of the famous ones. There's another guy named Polycarp, and his defense, his apologia takes the form of a letter to the Christian church in Rome, telling them why he does not want them to intervene in his martyrdom. But also, there's a guy in Athens named Athenagoras, and also Carthage, which, if you remember, was the city where the Donatist controversy originated. There's also a martyr named Tertullian from Carthage, who wrote a famous apologia. So those are some of the names in the notes. You can Google those people if you want to know more about them as individuals. And obviously not everybody who got martyred had the time or inclination to write something like this. And again, in some cases, they didn't write it, but somebody wrote it about them afterwards. So then after they challenged the whole premise of why it was not, it was not consistent with Roman law that if the Romans had even obeyed their own laws, this would never have happened, right? It wasn't even a righteous prosecution according to the existing laws. But given that that's not going to be persuasive, then they want to talk about why do they feel compelled to be faithful? What is it about Christianity that moves them so much that they are willing to go to these lengths to remain faithful to it? And so this is why this stuff is fascinating, because it gives us kind of a view into the Christian consciousness of the early church before it was politically powerful, right? And so the first thing, then they all start with this again, or they all go on to this, I should say, after they challenge the whole legal legitimacy of the thing, is the notion that pagan idols are not real. And they do often a lot of sarcasm about the fact that the pagan statues and the pagan temples are material objects, and they're carved or created by human beings. And when you strip them down from all their gold leaf and all their ivory and whatever, they're just stone, they're just wood. They have no power. You can hit them with sticks and they don't feel anything, and lightning bolts don't strike you, and you can beg and plead with them and ask them for favors and nothing will happen, because they are powerless, because they are only exist in the secular temporal world, and they have no sacred power. There's nothing about them that can actually do anybody any good, and so they want to make fun of the pagans and talk about how ridiculous it is that they put their faith in these material objects, and how much smarter the Christians are, because they understand that God cannot be located in a physical object, right? And you should hear a little echo of the Jewish heritage coming through this, that no graven images, no idol worship. There's still that sense that there's a moral superiority to recognizing God as being purely spiritual and having no material form that you can point to. But they have a good time with it. It's kind of like, it's kind of like a Trump rally. They're really setting up an easy target, kind of, and then everybody gets to chant "lock her up." It's almost that level of sort of ridicule and spitefulness, that your gods have no meaning, your gods have no power, your gods have no reality compared to ours. Then the next thing that they would argue is that, okay, let's postulate for a moment that the traditional gods, the Roman gods, whatever you want to call them, are real. They have no right to be jealous of the Christian God, the argument goes, because there's so many of them already. So, we don't think that, Zeus gets jealous when you're worshiping Hera. Well, actually, we think they do sometimes. But the point is that nobody says, well, nobody should go worship any other gods but Zeus because he's going to get annoyed, because we know that Poseidon would get annoyed if nobody came and worshiped him. In other words, because of the multiplicity of gods, they have to accept that many gods are going to be worshiped. So what's their problem with our God? Why should that be an issue for them? That all these other gods are being worshiped. Why should they be unwilling to have one more? So it's sort of turning that the argument that, well, Christians are a problem because they don't worship the old gods. It's kind of turning that argument back on them and saying, well, hey, why should that be a problem for them? They're still getting worshiped. All of these gods are getting worshiped. Why can't we have ours as well? And then the third argument about paganism was if you think these gods are real, they have human characteristics, and they have human vices that we have stories about them getting angry, we have stories about them getting jealous, we have stories about them being vain and lusting after humans and each other, and those gods are no better than human beings. What is in what are they superior? Our God is superior because our God is pure spirit, and our God has no anger and no lust, and is not, none of these sort of petty moral issues affect our God. Our God is, forever the same because perfection cannot change, right? And all of the traditional gods of the Roman pantheon are changeable. They change their mind. They have different ideas and different projects at different times. So how can they be perfect? And yeah, Anna.
Was it Paul or John? Where did we get this pure God? Because I know that the Old Testament was different. So where is the pure God, ethical God thing?
Well,
Where is that planted?
well, partly you can argue that it comes from Jesus. That he is, he's wanting us to perceive a personal relationship with a being whose primary nature is ethical, whose primary expectations in that relationship are ethical.
Okay.
And that have to do with how we treat the commandments, have to do with how we treat each other, rather than anything to do with how many goats you should sacrifice, or those kinds of issues. And then I think Paul's the one who picks up the contrast with Gentile conceptions of God. For Jesus, it's really his God versus the traditional God of Judaism, right? Jesus is in a conversation with conventional Judaism, not with Rome. He wants to reject Roman political domination,
Right.
but he does not feel challenged by the Roman gods. The only person he's challenged by is Caesar. So give to Caesar, give to the political authority. They are irrelevant to your spiritual connection to God. And for him, that comes out of the Jewish tradition. But Paul is going to go out and say, my primary competition, right, is this Roman pantheon, is this whole community of gods that are out there running around doing God knows what, right? And Paul is a pretty anal retentive guy himself. There's really no other way to say it. He's not very sexual that we can see. He's not very, it seems like Jesus was a person who enjoyed a nice cup of wine, enjoyed having a nice dinner party. He didn't want to be, he wasn't about conspicuous consumption, but he was about enjoying each other and enjoying life, right? Paul was not a particularly joyful guy from anything that we know. He wanted to get the world straightened out so that Jesus could come back. And in the meantime, it was not important that anybody had a good time. It was just, that'll be after, well, when we are spiritual beings, when we have been born again into the spirit, that's when joy is possible. That's when we can actually rejoice in who we are in our relationship with God. But it was not an agenda for him to rejoice now, other than to be happy that you found Jesus. So I think that's the progression,
Right.
and it becomes more and more an opposition. Your God is like this. Oh, well, our God is like that. So in the same way that the Yahweh cult was the church of not the goddess, the Christian cult became the church of not the Roman pantheon. right? Anything that you are, we're not. So, our God is changeless, and our God is not sexual, and our God is, not any of those things that that the Romans understood their gods to be. So it's kind of an evolution into that singular and idea of moral perfection.
It seems like this move to our God versus your whatever it is you have inevitably led to where we are with all this war, because it seems, I mean, obviously there were people fighting all those millions of years or thousands of years, but if you have all these gods and we have all these gods, and I'll let you have those, you let me have these. It seems like as long as you're not stealing their land, people were coexisting, I guess.
Right.
And this moral superiority stuff is an entirely different way to run the universe.
Right. Yes. And there are certainly anthropologists and religious historians who will argue that monotheism is always a precursor to empire. That as soon as you have only one possible God, then you are inevitably going to be in conflict with anybody else who proposes some other kind of God. Now, it's going to be interesting because Constantine is, although he's sincere, I think, and I agree with the interpretation of some scholars, that he's sincerely Christian as he understands it. But he's also aware that that's one out of 20 or something in his empire. He's in the significant minority, and he's not in a position to enforce it, right? The only thing he can really do is stop oppressing it.
Mm-hmm.
But then over several generations of his successors, as that the population balance begins to tip, it's going to be all right now. Hey, okay, we are in the majority. Now we can start enforcing this.
Right.
And then it's going to get, more and more and more pressure on anybody who doesn't conform.
Right.
Like a one-party system,
Mm-hmm.
where when you have multiple parties, you have a space there for people who don't agree. When you have a one-party system, there's no room at all.
Correct.
For points of view.
Right. That's right. So it's not that you can't have a tolerant monotheism, but I think it's kind of a balancing act. You have to put energy into maintaining that position, figuring out how you have that, much more than you do a tolerant polytheism.
But those people who are capable of having that balance and being enlightened enough to put that together are not the majority of the population anywhere. I mean, that's the problem. We have all these various,
Right.
You got to simplify it down to this one message, and it's us against them, which is what leads to all this mess.
Right.
Anyway.
Right. No, I agreed. Theology has consequences. Yes. If you take away nothing else from any of our conversations, it's not just angels dancing on the head of a pin. It's how do you understand the world and your role in it in relationship to other people. And this is why I think it's, both ironic and tragic that Jesus had this message about how we are to be with each other that gets transposed into the bizarrest kinds of things that the church will be and do eventually, supposedly out of, devotion to his message. Although I think his message, once Paul is through with it, his message
Message is lost.
important. He piece of it, right? Although people keep coming along and trying to bring it back, but often with not much success. So, right. So that was the arguments that the martyrs would make, or the would-be martyrs, about the pagan gods. This is why our God is better, right? Because your gods are not real, and your gods are not very nice if they were real. And there's a whole bunch of them, so why do you care? You know, I mean, you put all those things together and sort of why, it doesn't make any sense for you to persecute us. But then also they would argue, and furthermore, our community is better than your community. Our community is nicer than your community. So they would argue with some justification that that Christianity had a certain kind of sexual resistance, or it was not sex positive, shall we say. And the Roman pantheon was very sex positive, and the Roman society was pretty sex positive. Now, that is not to say that it was entirely promiscuous, and particularly among the upper classes and the people in power and leadership, because there was some sense of hereditary, passing down power, whether that was in the Senate or in the emperor itself, or even in the army. That families were kind of the unit more than individuals. But so therefore, if you want to be assured that your son is really your son, you're going to have expectations, at least about the women. And there was also a sense that sexual energy and leadership energy had the same source. And so on the one hand, if men were virile, it was natural that they would have a lot of sexual energy. And at the same time, if they did nothing but run around and have sex, there would be no energy left over to have the kind of military and administrative authority that effective leaders needed to have. So if you remember Elagabalus, that the guy who brought the meteor from Smyrna and was the emperor for a couple of years, he was very despised by both the Senate and the army because of his effeminacy. Yeah, he had a lot of sex, but it wasn't, it wasn't virile Roman, patriarchal sex. It was all this weird stuff. And so there's a piece of Roman culture that admires control, that admires being deliberate about how you expend your energy, and not just, promiscuous about how you expend your energy. So Christianity really seizes on that and appeals to that and says, we only have sex for procreation. And that's partly the influence of Paul, but it's also partly a response to the culture and also partly a response to the accusations, which are kind of made about any despised group, any group that you want to criticize. One of the things you say about them is, and they don't have any sexual boundaries at all. That's still kind of true. So it was something that the authorities sometimes said about the Christians. And all of these apologists want to set the record straight. No, we are faithful husbands and faithful wives, and we don't run around raping virgins, and we don't, all of these kinds of things that happen in the larger society. We don't do any of that. We are on the straight and narrow. So, and that there was a whole thing about the body in other respects as well, that we don't we don't pollute our bodies. And at this point, one of the things is we don't, we're not circumcised, you know, we don't mutilate our bodies for decoration. We do, you know, our bodies are temples, and that kind of philosophy was part of their argument against the pagan Roman culture. The other thing that they opposed, and this seems to genuinely be true, they opposed animal sacrifice in part because it was to other gods. You know, they didn't like that, but they didn't like the animal part of it either. So the sacrifice of this meal in commemoration of Jesus, that was a lot cleaner. That was a lot neater. That wasn't, you know, animals screaming and blood all over the altar and, you know, all the kind of drama and disruption that goes with that. The Christians said, no, that's done. We're not doing that anymore. It's primitive. It's uncivilized. It's, you know, we're better than that. You know, we're superior to that kind of stimulation, if you will. So it's a little bit like, like I don't like horror movies. You know, I don't like the intensity. I don't like the suspense and all that. I don't like having my my adrenaline disrupted, you know, and I think there was that same sort of aesthetic, you know, that's for the peasants, that's for the people who don't know any better. You know, we have a nice dinner of wine and bread and we're fine, thank you. You know, they're that sort of, but they also did not like or participate in the human blood sports. They didn't like going to the Colosseum, well, partly because it was sometimes Christians who were being fed to the lions, but even when it was criminals or even people who volunteered to be gladiators or whatever, they didn't like any of that. They thought that was displeasing to God. You know, it was not part of their repertoire. Yeah, Kay.
When did transubstantiation get into it?
Well, not yet.
Okay, so they didn't actually believe they were eating Christ.
No, not yet. Although we will get there.
Yeah, I was just trying to jive that with what you were saying. So
Right.
They were smart enough not to think that.
Well, I think what's going to happen is once that's the only sacrifice available, I mean, people who want, at this point, there was nothing stopping you from being a part of a cult that did engage in animal sacrifice if that appealed to you. Once that's more or less completely eliminated, then if you want that kind of imagery, you're going to have to find it in Christianity. You know what I mean? So then you're going to start having some of that, those concepts rise up. But for the moment, what they're trying to do is differentiate themselves from a culture where that is the general practice, and be, like I said, superior. Remember, this is a whole argument about why is Christianity better? Why is it worth me suffering and potentially dying for being a Christian? These are the ways in which it's better. So partly they're, yeah, Anna.
But as time goes on, the swath of Christianity gets more and more different people, and they have to appeal to those people's prior paradigms, right? So they start adding in these things that work.
Well, or just that there are certain personalities for whom that kind of intensity is engaging. You know, whether they ever remembered being pagan or not is not so much the point.
Right.
It's just in pagan times, they would have been the people who didn't find Christianity appealing. Right. You know, they would have been, you know, I want to go worship Zeus and, you know, cut the head off a bunny rabbit or whatever. So once you can no longer do that, then those people are going to be Christians too. You got to figure out what to do with them. Okay, right. So those were the two arguments for moral superiority. And then there was the idea that one of the constant, of course, accusations against Christianity was that it was an innovation. It was new. It was something that was never known before. And, you know, at this point, Jesus is still a historical figure. You know, you can't argue that it's a faith that goes back to the beginning of time, except to the extent that you can prove, and the Christian authors have always been, or some of them anyway, have always been eager to demonstrate that Jesus is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, right? Jesus is the thing that happens to fulfill the Hebrew scriptures. Now, originally that was of interest to the Jews, right? It was trying to prove to the Jewish community, hey, look, this is the Messiah. Now it's going to be of interest to the Roman community because it is going to be the claim that, in fact, this is a religion of great antiquity. In fact, it was predicted from the very beginning. This is just the next chapter has finally started, and yay, we're really excited about that. But it didn't start with Jesus, right? It started all the way back with Moses. It started all the way back with Adam and Eve. You know, it's very historical. It's older than anything you got, is basically the argument that they were making. So they spend a lot of time demonstrating, not necessarily because you believe the scriptures, but just to show that the setup for this event has been going on since ever, right? That's the important thing about that. Then one of their biggest arguments, and a lot of the texts are taken up with examples of miraculous healings and exorcisms. And that, of course, is what Jesus was known for too. And the ability or the power that he supposedly passed on then to his disciples so that they could demonstrate that they too were messengers of this God, was the ability to heal people both physically and mentally / emotionally. So the ancient understanding of that was driving out demons. You know, that if someone was afflicted with mania or depression or, you know, things that we would have a clinical description for today, all they knew to say was that, oh, they had a demon, something had taken possession of them. And so the idea was that the Christians were good at applying miraculous cures to these kinds of situations. Now, it was also thought to be physical, that you could have leprosy or you could have a physical disease and the Christians could cure you also. But I think the thing that more people probably actually had in their own experience was that someone who had some sort of personality affliction had some sort of experience with a Christian or the Christian community, and suddenly they were better. And that was seen as kind of a miracle, and it was seen as a proof of why Christianity was the right thing, why Christianity made sense. There was also the argument from conversion itself, in that they would tell stories about people who had very dissolute lives, very cruel or meaningless lives. And this goes all the way back to Paul. You know, here's Paul was a persecutor of the Christian sect, and all of a sudden he has this encounter with Jesus and he flips over. But the idea that people could have this experience and then their whole way of life would change. You know, they would go from being Scrooge to, you know, being transformed Scrooge, basically. And that also was a kind of proof of Christianity, that it had the power to have that kind of influence on people's lives. And so they would also tell those stories. And then the final kind of miracle was the miracle of martyrdom, or the miracle of witness, which was, if God did not give us the power to endure these things, these sufferings, these oppressions, how is it that we would endure them? You know, no one could stand it if they didn't have this kind of supernatural assistance, strengthening them and making it possible for them to withstand these experiences. So in that sense, the more suffering that they had, the more difficult their martyrdom was, the more credit they earned for Christianity as a whole, by proving that God was with them and God was strengthening them to go through this. And that was another proof that they offered. And so, for instance, when Polycarp says to the Roman Church, don't get in the way, it's because he wants to demonstrate the power of God to uphold him through whatever it is that they're going to throw at him from the Roman authorities. Right? So all of those things were sort of proofs of God, the Christian God's miraculous power in people's lives. And then the final arguments were either or both. One, that this was the God who offered personal immortality. This was the God who had heaven waiting for those who were faithful. And so this is what the person who's writing this, or the person who they're writing about, had confidence that this was what they were going to. I mean, it's kind of like the Islamic martyrs who think that they're going to have 72 virgins and the temple in paradise and all that. But there's a sense of assurance that, okay, this is what I'm certain of, and this is part of why I'm willing to undergo these persecutions, because I'm so confident that my immortality is assured, and your immortality could be assured too. You know, there's always that argument of same thing is available for you. And then finally, there's this offer of being on the right side of history, of saying, you know, all of these things have been fulfilled, all of these prophecies have come to be. And the final prophecy, of course, is that Jesus is coming again. You know, the return is still envisioned. You know, it's not perhaps within our lifetimes, because it wasn't within the lifetimes of the people who thought it was going to be, but it's still going to happen at some point. And in fact, just as for some people, the fall of the temple in 70 AD was sort of like a signal that was going to happen, other people began to look ahead to the fall of the Roman Empire as being the signal that this is about to happen. That, you know, the Roman Empire has to kind of run its course as almost the host organism for the beginning of Christianity. And then when that is done, when that dies, then that's the moment at which Jesus will return and the next chapter will unfold. And if you want to be on the right side of history, if you want to be able to say, see, we told you so, you know, if you want to be on the side of the angels, as we say, then you want to be a Christian when that happens, because that's going to be the victorious side, that we're going to win in the end when Jesus comes back. And it's not just, I mean, there's a certain part of it that is like, we're going to be able to say, we told you so. You know, there's a certain self-righteousness, but it's also going to be, look, we're the ones who knew what we were talking about. You know, we had the accurate predictions. Don't you want to be part of that group that had those accurate predictions? So those were the series of arguments that those writers made. And then, just like with the letters of Paul, those would get copied and sent around from one church to the other, so that everybody could hear those stories read and be familiar with them and learn the arguments, just in case, you know, you were one of the people that someday had to be held accountable for being a Christian, and what should you say and how should you look at that if that also happened to you. But also, look how loyal these people were. These are the reasons they were persuaded. You should be persuaded too by these same arguments and these same miracles. So that's the literature that was happening in that period, from the end of the writing of the Gospels up through the beginning of the canonization of what would become the New Testament, because those pieces were centuries old by the time they got assembled in the way we have them today. So does that make sense in terms of what was happening and how this kind of minority group, I mean, 5 million is not a small number, but when you consider the area that they were scattered over and the larger population that they were mixed into, they're still pretty much of a minority, even by the time that Constantine is active. Yeah, Kay.
Does any of this apologia or any of these arguments make it into the canon? Do we find any of this in the Bible?
No, not really. You know, you can, if you squint, you can kind of see Revelation as a precursor to this form of literature. You know, because here's this guy exiled on this island, and he's having this vision of how it's going to turn out that he was right, and the next chapter of history is going to unfold, and this righteous God is going to come and judge. You know, I mean, there's some features that are there, and of course, Revelation is the latest piece that gets incorporated into the New Testament. But it's not as fully developed as it will be, you know, 70, 80 years later when you really start getting these apologias written. But it's, you know, the prototype is there, let's say.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. What other questions might anyone have? We have a few minutes left, and that was what I wanted to cover.
Well,
yeah,
Kendall, when you were talking about empires and one gods and all that, I was reminded of what you taught in the class that I took one other time about Spain.
Mm.
And when the Muslims were in charge and they let whoever worship whoever they wanted to, it worked great.
Well, be clear. They let the Jews be the Jews and they let the Christians be the Christians.
Exactly.
That doesn't mean you could worship whatever you wanted to.
Well,
it was those three groups. So, you know, don't show up with your African god, you know, or something like that. But still, it was remarkable for the time.
And it wasn't until Spain took over and enforced Christianity that people started being hurt by religion so badly.
You know, it's interesting because Spain was in 700. Spain was controlled by the Visigoths when the Muslim forces arrived around 700. And that's because when the Visigoths invaded Rome, Rome said, we will fight you off from, you are not going to take over our territory here in Italy. But we happen to have this territory way over there on the Iberian Peninsula. And we would be happy for you to go there as our deputies, you know, as our administrators, and send us a little bit of tribute every once in a while, and we'll let you take over the place. And the Visigoths liked that because they were from way in the north and they hated that weather. And so they were trying to migrate south. And so they migrated into what is now Spain. And that's who was running the place when the Muslims arrived. Now, the Visigoths were originally evangelized up north in Germany and Russia, by Aryans. So when they came through Rome and when they were sent to Spain, they remained Aryans. They were little u Unitarians, who believed that Jesus was not God. And so therefore it was easier for them. They were running the place. I mean, Spain was Christian when the Muslims got there, but it was Aryan Christian. And so it was a lot easier for them to get along with the Muslims than it would have been for the Trinitarian Roman Christians. So it wasn't until Ferdinand and Isabella reconquered Spain for the Roman Catholic Church that Spain became Trinitarian Christian and then kicked the Jews and the Muslims out. So I just, those are always interesting connections to me. And, you know, there's always minor forms of religious oppression. You know, I don't want us to get thinking that, you know, Spain was this paradise on earth. Compared to what was happening in the rest of Europe, it kind of was, but there were still limitations. I mean, there were ways in which it was advantageous to be a Muslim under the Muslim rule, but it wasn't fatal to be something else.
Kendall,
Yeah.
in a sentence or two,
Rarely, but okay, I'll try.
right. It seems like Islam went from continent to continent. Did they have a Paul thing going on, or did they have like these letters? Or, I mean, how does that word of mouth, how does that spread? Like, it seems like it did it as much or better than Christianity did it in the time that it took.
Right. Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, and we'll talk about this way more when we get to that era, but Islam had no cultural competition. And that the major thing about its spread was that when it came about on the Arabian Peninsula, there was no competing force. There were a whole bunch of teeny tiny little local gods and goddesses and shrines. So it was a very unstructured paganism that it was up against. And it stole liberally from both Judaism and Christianity in terms of its understanding of a religious institution and structure. So it kind of was able to benefit from the lessons learned by both the Jews and the Christians about how to do this thing. So I think both of those things helped to explain. And also it was very militant. I mean, it was from the beginning, it was not shy about saying, you will be Muslim or you will not be part of this community. And whether that meant being kicked out or whether that meant being killed out of hand, it was very willing to impose itself. At the same time, it was also willing to be tolerant in certain ways about who else was around, as long as they were people of the book, you know, if they were children of Abraham, as we say. But that's a very good question, because it compared to Judaism, which was like molasses,
Right.
and compared to Christianity, which was maybe like turning on the air conditioner. I mean, Islam was like lightning in terms.
And maybe it was much later too, so maybe that helps as well. I mean,
and also it was a more literate culture, so that writing was more effective within that process. Okay, well, anybody else? In that case, I will see you next week, right?
Thank you.
All right.
thank
Take
you so
care,
much,
everybody.
Kendall.
Bye, thank
Of course.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.